Utilizing Project TV.
Hi, my name is Alex Wiles, and thank you for watching MMP TV, where we tell the untold stories of those uniting across struggles to put people first. Today, we have as our guest John Wessel-McCoy of the Poverty Initiative. He will be talking about the American abolitionist movement and the importance of looking at social movements of the past in order to inform movements of the present and the future. So, thanks for coming. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Alex.
You doing good?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Yeah.
All right. Great. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Poverty Initiative?
I work as the project organizer for the Poverty Initiative. I've been working with the Poverty Initiative since 2004, which is the year that it got started. We're housed up at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And just to kind of say a little bit about the mission of the Poverty Initiative is to raise up generations of community and religious leaders who are committed, dedicated to building a social movement to end poverty led by the poor. We've been, we come out of a longer history than even just the 2004, our founding in 2004. We trace a lot of our sort of lineage and our inspiration and what we're about from the work going back to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King in the last years of his life started moving towards economic human rights. He started working, at the same time that he came out against the war in Vietnam. He came out with the Poor People's Campaign, and the Poor People's Campaign was this very important effort to unite the poor and dispossessed of this country across color lines and all other lines that divide. There's a long history in this country of the poor being pitted against each other, not being able to unite. Race is a big sort of part of that history, but there's a lot of other ways that people are divided. In terms of myself, I got into this work. Before I worked for the Poverty Initiative, I worked as a union organizer and did community organizing. I'm originally from Decatur, Illinois, which is a small town in central Illinois, about 3 hours south of Chicago. And where I grew up, it's kind of an industrial town, Decatur is, and it was a lot of union type jobs, but when I was in high school, a lot of that was coming to an end, like in a lot of places throughout the Rust Belt and
like a lot how it has been recently with a lot of people graduating and not being able to find jobs.
Yeah, well, I mean that was the thing. I mean, in terms of the American dream as we understood it back then, my dad's generation, my mom's generation, my mom's a postal worker, that kind of experience where a person could get out of high school and even with a high school diploma have a reasonable expectation to get a job that paid enough for them to buy a house and get their kids educated and everything like that. But all of that was coming to an end when we were, when I was, growing up there. And so that had a lot to do with who I am and what I'm committed to. I kind of got into this work through labor and thinking about labor organizing, but I've also come to see that it's the work of whether you're fighting around work issues or health care or housing or whatever, that it's connected to something bigger.
So that's a broader issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so recently the Poverty Initiative conducted a really immersive study on the American abolitionist movement.
Yeah.
So what is the significance of studying that particular movement in a context of today?
If you've come up through the public education or the American educational system like I have, I assume you have too, Alex, that the way that, it's a great disservice done in terms of what little history we're taught. We don't know anything about history. We don't know anything about economics. And so the Poverty Scholars Program looks at these things. Now, the abolitionist movement as a social movement in American history, we feel is a very important thing for us to study. If anybody out there who's working and doing organizing and trying to do transformative type, social movement type work, if they're drawing at all from history, they tend to draw from two main social movements that have happened in the past 20th century, and that's the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the industrial union movement of the 1930s. And those are really righteous struggles. There's people put their lives on the line, they sacrificed, there was genius involved, those were important movements. But one thing that we would argue at the Poverty Initiative is that both of those movements, as great as and important as they were fundamentally movements to win concessions from an existing system. They did not fundamentally challenge the way the power structure was set up.
So you're saying they were looking for more of a compromise?
Right, concessions, winning recognition, winning a seat at the table, a bigger slice of the pie, whatever you want to call it. But the abolitionist movement is important for us to study, and we think at the Poverty Initiative has a lot of lessons for the work we need to do now, because you couldn't have a movement to reform slavery. You couldn't have a movement that said, let's make a kinder, gentler form of slavery. The abolitionist movement's fundamental strategic aim was the ending of slavery. You had to end slavery and in order for that movement to succeed. And I feel like we're living in a time as more and more people are dispossessed, whether it's in my hometown in Decatur, or it's here in Philadelphia, or New York, or Texas, or wherever, that people are increasingly being dispossessed and thrown into the ranks of the poor. And we need to build a movement to end poverty and restructure the system. And that requires challenging the system. Back then, the 1%, just to use the terms that we use these days, in terms of the 1% was the slave power. That was the people who held slaves, the 4 million enslaved people in the South, black people, held by 300 and some odd thousand slaveholders. And they were the most powerful force in American politics and economy, society in those days, leading up to the Civil War.
So you're saying that the power structure might carry over to how things work now? Or?
Well, yeah, we live in a time where there's an increasing concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And this is where it's important for us to understand how economics affect other things like society and politics. People who have a concentration of wealth also have the loudest voice and the most power muscle in terms of politics. And so we need to organize around, that's one of the things that came out of Occupy, this whole Occupy movement, was this formulation of the notion of, the 1% versus the 99%. I think there's something true to that. And so that's what we're sort of working with. So,
okay, so when it comes to the use of media, like newspapers, speeches, etc., when it comes to winning the hearts and minds in this social movement, what lessons do you think you can learn from what you saw?
Well,
in terms of like disseminating information and using it to organize people.
This is where lessons from the abolitionist movement around the question of media, it has a lot to do with our situation today. One of the things that we say often at the Poverty Initiative is that the powers that be are not going to pay you to kick their ass, okay? And they're certainly not going to give you voice through the media that they control. And so the abolitionists as a movement, as they're passing through the many phases that the abolitionist movement went through, one of the things that was really at the center of their movement was the use of media. Now, in those days, the highest form of of media was the newspaper and printing booklets, pamphlets, newspapers. You know, Frederick Douglass, you know, he had his own newspaper, the North Star. The abolitionists understood, and I mean, because they certainly weren't going to get their views, which is the equality of people across color lines, the need to end slavery, the, you know, immediate ending of slavery. These things were not going to get expressed through the mainstream media, and so they had to create their own media. The other thing that you have to understand, and I think this is...
Wait, would you say that was like more like independent media?
Yeah, absolutely. Independent media. And finding ways to sort of distribute. One of the things that I think is really true about media is that media is really about education. And so in the days of the abolitionist movement, one of the really important things that happened through the press, through the abolitionist press, was the telling of untold stories, which is the, you know, MMP's sort of motto, right? But those untold stories were the slave narratives, right? Because the mainstream press at the time was putting this view, and the mainstream press was owned by the slave power or controlled, right? Like up north here even, it was the textile industry, the industries that were related to cotton production, all basically towed the line and walked the line that for the slaveholders down south, right? Because it was in their economic interest to do that. And so the sort of story that would get told is that slaves are happy down there on their plantations. Slaves they are best suited. You know, black people are best suited there, and everything's great. And what happened with the Underground Railroad, where you had people actively doing this sort of acts of resistance, you know, in tandem with the telling of those stories, right? And those were being the telling of those stories through, you know, through newspapers, through the publication of books like Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, telling these slave narratives where people were saying, hell no, this is a brutal, unjust system and it needs to end. And so this is a really key lesson, I think, that for us to learn about our present situation.
All right. Completely understand that. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So when it comes to applying those principles, when it comes to independent media and telling untold stories, how would you tell people to apply that now? Because I feel like it's a lot easier to get messages out now because we have the internet.
Yeah.
But back then, all you had was, you know, the written word, and
right,
it was the only way to get that to someone was to physically hand it to them.
That's
Meanwhile,
true.
now you can, with the press of a button, send that same thing to someone on the other side of the world in a split second.
I'm no expert on that, but I think, I mean, actually, I take a lot of sort of inspiration, and I gain a lot of knowledge from working with groups like Media Mobilizing Project, and in terms of really being sort of engaged. This is the key point with the abolitionists, right? We have this concept in our study of abolitionists where we talk about the writing and the running abolitionists. Okay, Harriet Tubman was a running abolitionist. In fact, Harriet Tubman, she was illiterate. She never learned to read even until the day she died, and she lived a long time. But John Brown, you know, was another running abolitionist. But people like Frederick Douglass, who also participated in the Underground Railroad operations, also was out there. He was directly engaged. See, like he wasn't just like like in the way that sometimes independent media even falls into this trap where they're like, the movement, the struggle's out there, and we're going to report on it. There has to be a voice and a sort of a very integrated relationship between the struggle and the voice. And so that's when you're talking about building an independent media infrastructure. What is that independent media infrastructure connected to? It's got to be connected to the building of a social movement. And so that requires people getting on the same page about the strategic, you know, what is our strategy? We would argue that the strategy is building a broad social movement to end poverty.
All right, to abolish poverty.
It's the abolitionist movement to end poverty, that's right.
What lessons do you think can be learned from studying this movement, and how do we apply those lessons in our current social movement? Or a better question would be, what mistakes were made that we can avoid now?
Well, yeah, there were definitely mistakes made, and people will challenge the, okay, the ending of slavery. There's a way that I think a lot of us, kind of look back at that history, and you might, so social movements pass through phases, right? And I think that we have to understand what stage are we in right now in building a social movement, right? I mean, a baby has to crawl before it can walk, and these kinds of things. And so I think that that's one of the things that's important, is to look at how social movements emerge. And you can't just want things, just because you think things ought to be this way, right? Doesn't, you have to understand the politics, the economy, everything in terms of all the forces that are at play in order for, a social movement to succeed. One of the things that we're doing as leaders, and I should say, like, our study involves organizers and leaders, not just like academics who are like reading this stuff and trying to write a doctoral thesis. Mm-hmm. We're trying to engage folks who are really trying to solve problems on these sort of levels where people are really hurting.
So taking like an active role
right.
in the things. It's not enough to like just say things or like
exactly.
Or as you do see today, like just sharing things on Facebook. It's like that you have to actually
do
something.
Yeah,
about
you actually
it,
have
active role in it.
I agree.
All right. So if people want to get a part, to actually be an active member in the Poverty Initiative, or to help you guys, or to disseminate information to other people who might need to hear about it, where would they go? Well,
I mean, you can find us online. I mean, we're povertyinitiative.org.
Catchy.
We've been going around. We recently published a book called The Pedagogy of the Poor. I should have brought a copy with me here, but it's we've been going on this book tour around the country. We've been in over 25 states in the past year, and we've been out there reaching out to folks who are struggling in communities. We've been to community-based organizations, churches, college campuses, and we're open to anybody that's interested. We encourage people to reach out to us. But I would say too is that it's not just about the Poverty Initiative. We're working within a network of relationships, and so we connect with groups like MMP and folks down here in Philadelphia that are really engaged in the struggle. So yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here. It was great having you.
My pleasure.
A lot of great history shared, a lot of things I didn't know.
Awesome.
So that was awesome.
Yeah.
At MMP, we know that we must learn from history to understand how to face the forces we're up against today. We also know that struggles for education, healthcare, housing, and living wages are deeply connected, and that it's going to take a movement to eliminate the structural inequality at the root of all our struggles, and to ensure that people are put first in our society. Stay tuned on PhillyCam and MediaMobilizing.org. I'm Alex Wiles, and thank you for watching MMP TV.
Media Mobilizing Project